1. In the interest of time, we will not do a roll call, but all attendees' names will be noted on the wiki agenda page after today's meeting. We will have English, French, Spanish, and Russian interpretation on today's meeting. A kind reminder to please speak clearly and slowly to allow for accurate interpretation. And also please state your names every time you speak, not only for transcription purposes, but also for the interpreters to identify you on the other language channels. Thank you so much. And I will hand the call back over to Sébastien Bachelet, Chair of Euralo.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much, everybody, for participating to this monthly roundtable. It's the 5th one that Euralo is organizing. And we are very proud of this production of 4 and now the 5th one of the roundtable. And we're also very proud that today we have very great speaker. And I would like to emphasize that the main topic of this is work done by our member of ALAC, nominated by the nominating committee to join the ALAC. It was a very good decision, and I am sure that what she's doing will help immensely ICANN and Euralo to learn better about data and politics. And therefore, I would like to give the floor to Joanna Kulesza, who will be moderating the whole session, and I will just come back at the end to say a few words, but have a good 1.5 hour roundtable. Thank you, Pari, thank you, Gregory, thank you, Paul. And Paul, you are thanks twice because you are a returning speaker in our monthly roundtable. You were the first at the first one, and now at the 5th one. Maybe at the 10th one, you will be still with us. Thank you very much. Joanna, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sebastian. Thank you to Pari for organizing this. I was just hired to do the moderation, so I have nothing to do with this. It's all Pari's work. But I am really excited to be moderating this, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. As Sebastian noted, Pari and Greg have provided a paper, which is interesting because it does cover all things data and geopolitics, whereas I am certain Paul will have the Euralo or European perspective to add to that paper. So without further ado, the speakers are on a specific timed agenda, and I'm the one that's supposed to time it. So because we are on a timer here, I'm going to hand the floor directly to Pari and Gregory. I know you guys have a few slides, and the agenda indicates that it is 15 minutes for each of the speakers to start us off. I'm going to hand the floor to Pari. I know that you will share the floor with Gregory. Please go right ahead. If there are questions coming up, do feel free to indicate them in the chat. We will keep an eye on the chat, and the questions will be noted. After the presentations, there will be a Q&A session. You are more than welcome to raise your hand and ask the questions directly. But if there are any questions popping up during the presentations, just do feel free to add them into the chat. And I will be back after the presentations. Pari and Gregory, the floor is yours. Very much looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you. Whoever acquires and controls data will attain hegemony, says Modi, the Indian Prime Minister. And he's not alone. A chorus of voices from President Putin to Angela Merkel to Macron and many more are joining in concert. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I am delighted to be here. As Joanna said, I will be presenting this paper together with Greg Treverton. I would let him to introduce himself. So Greg, would you like to say a few things about yourself, and then we continue the discussion?
Sure. I've been in and out of government more times than the law should permit. I was most recently a chair of the National Intelligence Council in the second Obama administration. I'm now teaching at the University of Southern California, and with Pari have created the Global TechnoPolitics Forum.
Thank you very much, Greg. So data, not long ago, was just a byproduct of internet. Yet the invention of artificial intelligence and deep machine learning turned data into the key factor for innovation. Data is information, and big data is often seen as lots of data. Thus, data, information, and big data overlap, and so do the issues involved in governing them. Those issues range from mundane, like where the data center will be located, to questions bearing on the nature of democracy, such as how will this information and hate speech be policed and by whom? So in the process, how data is collected, stored, protected, accessed, used, and transferred over national borders is becoming caught up in geopolitics. As for data governance, it has become a hackneyed word, but to the extent that data is governed, it's a byproduct of internet governance. Overall, internet governance is scattered and multi-stakeholder. ICANN is a very good example of it, and you all are familiar with that. It's bottom-up and driven by loose coordination among various players. Sorry. It's complex. Data governance is complex with many layers and actors, and it's dynamic as invention continues and politics change. Issues in governing the internet and data overlap, cut across policy areas, and often and even conflict. A clear example is the privacy and security. Next slide, please. Any discussion of data governance inevitably touches on politics and must confront the fundamental cultural differences that divide countries and influence their policies. A good example is Europe and United States, where the emphasis and value placed on privacy is much higher in Europe than US, but the emphasis on free speech is much higher in United States, and they reflect then in the policies. More importantly are the ideological differences that exist. For example, Silicon Valley or tech giants are increasingly important. They started by believe in open internet and free flow of data, and faintly anarchist motto of data wants to be free. Then we have United States, which is a market-based internet view, and basically would rather believes that market would govern itself, and there is a need for some legislation. Europe differs on that. Its approach to internet governance mostly seeks to maximize freedom for online users, but under tight government regulations. Then we have Beijing, champion in authoritarian vision, as represented by the Great Firewall, a tightly controlled collaboration in which the government closely monitors technology. And finally, we have Moscow, which increasingly it seems that it's assuming an spoiler role and aims to disrupt the international order. And on that note, I turn the floor to Greg to discuss that.
Thanks, Pari. My caricature for difference among the three main models of the internet, I used to think of the United States was basically let her rip. The European model was, we'd like to control this if we can figure out how to do it. And of course, the Chinese model is we're going to control this firmly, just like we control every other medium. This slide is a bit of a caricature. The top line is really just to illustrate how much the world has changed. This is a vision of the Cold War, when there was an East and a West, a Soviet Union, the United States and their allies. There was essentially no China to speak of, and there was very little economic interchange between the East and the West. So a very different world. And now we have a world, as we know, that in which China is a major and rising power, important player, but we also have other important actors. India, technologically sophisticated, if still poor, and lots of other countries. And one of the things that was striking, and here I'm being maybe perhaps a little America-centric, but one of the things that was striking in my country during the pandemic was, since we had no national leadership, the locals, the governors and mayors became important players, and they too are important players when we think about the internet and data governance. But most important, I suspect, is that while we've known that private actors, or at least company actors, have had geopolitical power for at least 300 years, since the East India Company, that's the striking feature of our time, it seems to me, the rise of the tech giants, but not just the tech giants, and their situation really as geopolitical forces in their own right. Obviously, the tech giants are visible and important, but not alone. When the Gates Foundation spends more on health in Africa than the World Health Organization, we know that the private sector is increasingly important. States aren't about to go away, and their power conflicts will continue, but the private sector is, and this seems to me to be the basis of ICANN as well, is really the driving force in these matters. I was struck when I was preparing for this by how, and here I'm being America-centric again, I suppose, but how the debate in the United States and Europe is both similar and different. Take something like data sovereignty, about which I think Paul will have something to say later. That's obviously a big and important issue in Europe, not much discussed in the United States. To the extent it is, it probably refers to individual sovereignty over data, not national sovereignty over data that is transmitted through or into a particular country. Americans, I suspect, still continue to be more suspicious of the government than Europeans are, and maybe even still more trusting of the private sector than are Europeans. One of the interesting new, I think, geopolitical features is what Pari and I have called digital corridors. Let me turn it back to her to say a word more about that issue.
Thank you, Greg. Pari speaking. So one important region is Central Asia. And we see that digital corridors formed. It has untapped resources, unserved population, and underdeveloped infrastructure. Two major global actors have recognized the potential in developing Central Asia and have made investment in physical and digital connectivity infrastructure throughout the region. One is India. In 2002, India, Russia, and Iran signed a deal to develop international north-south transport corridor that connects Mumbai to Moscow. Meanwhile, China has aggressively pursued its Belt and Road and Digital Silk Road initiatives, luring national leaders into massive debt, and with cutting-edge technology and the prospect of greater control over their people. So if Indian corridors are connecting north to south, the Chinese corridors connecting east to west, and the two projects give Central Asia access almost to markets in all directions. Now, China's dominance of digital infrastructure, which these corridors could guarantee and offer a lot of mastery and influence, is a bit concerning because it's positioned to build the norms of data governance, positions China to build the norms of data governance, financial systems, and regulation that shape those systems. Already the three countries, meaning India, China, and Russia, have a strong policies towards localizing data at home. And this creates a concern over the potential for global stability and order. Next slide, please. Data touches on all aspects of our lives, and there are many dimensions to look at data. Here, I have mentioned several of them. Because of the concern for time, we will touch upon only 4 that's colored in blue, meaning privacy, content, trade, and security. With that, I turn the floor to Greg to discuss privacy. Floor is yours, Greg.
Thank you. Greg talking. Next slide, please. I think we're all aware that the tech giants, the Facebooks and Googles and others, essentially stumbled in to a business model that was hugely profitable and is hugely profitable, but is also hugely invasive of privacy. And that makes privacy a front and central issue as we think about internet and data governance. It's striking to me that probably the 2 most important pieces of legislation enacted, neither was enacted by a nation state. They were the union's Gdpr and the California Consumer Protection Act, the Citizen Privacy Act. They're probably the 2 most important pieces of legislation. They embody somewhat different, as I think everyone on this call knows, different approaches to privacy. GDPR is mostly opt-in, where you have to positively agree to have your data collected. The California Act is mostly opt-out, letting citizens opt out when they choose. GDPR has become an important model. It does seem the model that many countries around the world are following. And it's a good model, a very good beginning. What strikes me is we're just at the beginning of thinking about how to cope with privacy in this realm. And the next challenge, as I see it, is going to be huge volumes. We're worried about volume now, but think about a world in which everybody has a dozen sensors on their body, is monitoring 50 more sensors at their office, home, and car. How you manage to have a system that's simple enough to be understandable, but really does put people in real control of their data, that I think is going to be a big challenge moving forward. So we've got really GDPR as a very good and interesting start. The challenge will be to deal, I think, in a future where the technology changes, but in particular the amount of data that's out there to be collected and to be usefully collected, since we'll make great advances in medicine if we can aggregate huge amounts of data from individual sensors, but we have to find a way to do that in a way that is compatible with some sense of privacy. Back to you, Pari. The most important, well, just the introduction, I think the most important, and again, here I may be America-centric again, but no surprise, at least in the United States, the biggest issue around data these days has been content and how we police content on these big platforms. Back to you, Pari.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So the challenge of regulation that internet technologies move fast while governmental processes are slow, as Greg also mentioned. A good example is the Section 230. It came about in 1996. The idea was to protect innovation, but over the years, it has become clear that it has caused a lot of problems. The both sides of the aisle in the United States are particularly concerned. In one hand, the conservatives complain that it censors their view. We saw how tech giants managed to censor the president at the time. And then from the left, we have complained about disinformation and interference in elections. So it's problematic in both sides. Proposal has lately, since 2019, has come about to amend the section, to limit, in fact, Section 230. And there is a possibility, there are bills right now in Senate, and there is a possibility that some degree of limits comes to play. Similar situation we see around the world. In India, in year 2000, Information Technology Act came about, while it also provided some content provider with some kind of immunity, but it was more conditional. And in recent years, that idea has been revisited, and they try now to add conditions to that. Similarly, in EU 2002, there was e-commerce directive. And then again, in 2020, Digital Service Act is touching upon it and introducing limits. Meanwhile, individual countries within Europe, France, Germany, and even UK, each of them are coming with their own limitation. Meanwhile, China approached these issues differently. The constitution in China offers citizens some degree of freedom of expression. However, under banner of government secrets, they can censor everything. So China is totally different in the sense of controlling content providers. It's fully controlled, and even since 2019, online information content ecosystem has provided a more comprehensive framework, and they're expected not only proactively to identify what they call harmful information, they also are expected to disseminate some positive information, meaning some kind of propaganda. And these are all happening under discussion of security, which is a good point to turn the floor to Greg to discuss that.
Next slide, please. Plainly, security is an enormous issue, one that runs well beyond data and data governance. But we did inherit a set of cyber legacy that was about being accessible, not about being secure. And therefore, in some sense, we're confronting what was an unanticipated, or at least it took us a long time to understand how severe the security problem was. We've had that driven home to us in the United States lately with the SolarWinds and the Colonial Pipeline hacks. We can talk more about those if people are interested. What they demonstrate, I think, for us is that probably we were paying too much attention to offense, to defend forward, and not enough to defense. That'll mean we need to recalibrate how we think about, I think, the cyber realm. I've worried for a long time that when you talk to individual companies, they say we can afford to take 5% losses, and better that than inform about our breaches and therefore send our customers to somebody else. I've worried that what may be okay for a big bank when repeated across the entire country or entire economy isn't good enough, and that we have a kind of prisoner's dilemma that leaves us underprotected. It's interesting, this is a little bit of a side note, to note that what's happened in the United States is that we have bit by bit, maybe faute de mieux, made NSA, our SIGINT service, into the central organization for cyber in not just the government, but in the country. Other countries that I know well, like Sweden, have done something similar, but it is an interesting example of the challenge. There is now in the United States, and Mr. Biden has issued a new executive order. It's trying to make some of the needed reforms, changes after the big hacks. It's going to have stricter standards for supply chains, particularly IT supply chains, also much stricter reporting requirements. It'll probably also beef up what is I always think of this as like New York, New York. People like the term so much they used it twice. This is the Homeland Security, Cybersecurity, and Infrastructure Security Agency. Like security so much they used it twice. You can't be in government as long as I've been off and on and not to be struck by acronyms. So this realm has spawned a number. My all-time favorite probably is about 2 decades ago. The EU had something called the Concerted Reflation Action Program. That's probably my all-time favorite acronym. The other thing the executive order will do is create a national cyber director. We've had a long string of cyber czars in the United States, mostly of which have turned out to be cyber czardines without much authority or power. I hope we can do better this time around. And the final issue, I think, in security is really thinking about rules of the road. We're at such, as Pari emphasized earlier, there's such visions of the web out there and lots of competition about it, but at least beginning to have a conversation about rules of the road seems to me to be important. The 2015 agreement, first between the United States and China, and then China and other countries, not to do cyber espionage for commercial purposes, actually worked relatively well for a couple of years until it was overtaken by worsening US-China relations. But that's a place to start. I think the place to start is probably with like-minded countries, the United States, Europe, and our Asian friends, to come up with rules that we would think sensible, and then begin to see if we can engage Russia and China and others in that conversation. Presumably the North Koreas and Irans are not likely to participate, but having a start would be, it seems to me, the right thing to do. Back to you for the next issue, Pari.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So given that data is now a precious commodity as well as a source of power, data flow across borders have become important for global trade and are subject to the existing global trade system. However, that system was built right after World War II in 1947. GATT later became WTO 1995. So over the last few decades, digital trade has become a major part of the trade flow. However, what constitutes digital trade varies depending on which country one examines. Absence of a globally agreed on definition of digital trade means there is also no set of international law to govern it. And that key issues are treated differently in different agreements. The historic focus of trade policy has been visible barriers like tariffs and quota. However, many internet and data policies represent non-tariff barriers. So here we have mentioned 4 of them: barriers to internet services, and localization barriers, technology barriers, other barriers. So these are like cybersecurity threats or weak internet IPRs, restriction on use of encryption, IPR transfer, local request for local certification, data localization, comprehensive privacy requirements. That one particularly affects Europe, requirements to use local technology, and also foreign investment restrictions, duties on digital goods and services. Here we have a map. If we look at it, it's the countries which are perceived by United States as creating non-tariff barriers. We can see that beyond the usual suspects of China and some other countries, Europe is colored strongly, meaning the Privacy Act is one of the issues that perceived as creating a barrier. So next slide, please. So from this very brief discussion of various aspects of data policies, we see that today a patchwork of privacy laws and industry self-regulation lacks transparency and coherence, with adverse impact on innovation and competition, and do not protect global citizens' privacy while driving an escalations in geopolitical tension. So the key question is, are geopolitical tensions inevitable? I think they are, but I pass the floor to Greg to discuss it further, that how that's possible.
Next slide. If we think about how to move forward, again, it's worth thinking about the legacy. We have, as Pari said, something of a hodgepodge of institutions dealing with these issues in different ways. Some deal with some parts of the issue and others with other parts, and some with none at all. This is just a couple here, important issues. I think the thing to be said about them is these institutions, mostly creatures of Bretton Woods and after the aftermath of Bretton Woods, have really served us very well, have served the world very well. But now they seem mismatched to the task at hand, which is really to deal with the geopolitical tensions in very different circumstances, in circumstances when the existing institutions tend to underrepresent both the new powers like China and really don't have much place at all for the private sector, which we know is driving these developments. I recall in my last incarnation of government sitting in a deputies committee meeting, and we were talking about international arrangements, international partnerships. And at some point I got frustrated and said, what about the private sector? How do we incorporate the private sector in these intergovernmental organizations? Everybody said, yeah, important point. And then 2 minutes later, the conversation was back in the same old intergovernmental track that it had been on before. Certainly these organizations have a role to play, but our sense is that we need to bridge from this traditional set of organizations to a more inclusive, more set of conversations that is more representative of the true set of stakeholders. And let me turn for that purpose back to Pari for our idea. At least at this point, it's really a contribution to the debate of something we think has promise, but let her explain it to you.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So that brings us to the idea of D20, the digital 20 as we call it. It's a new initiative launched by the Global TechnoPolitics Forum, aiming to fill the void that just now Greg explained. And it aims to function as a bridge between the existing global architecture and the new geopolitical context. So it sits and collaborates with Bretton Woods Institution, Internet Funding Organization, and various other think tanks. It's a multi-stakeholder model. Its aim is to, it's reached its aims through small, intimate convenings. These are private, exclusive convenings, closed door, and aims to build trust. It's by allowing members to form a shared diagnosis of the problems. So that way they gain trust and better understanding. It tries, through this built-in trust, it tries to broaden the dialogue to larger stakeholders and shift the focus to problems that are initiated or created by new digital words. So, and the ultimate aim is to produce actionable and measurable outcomes. And with that, I turn the floor to Paul.
Thank you very much, Pari, Gregory. I'm really honored that I can be here. Thank you also very much, Sebastian and Joanna. Honored, and it's a pleasure to be back here again because the themes continue to keep us very much interested and engaged. If you allow me, I will share my screen because then I can use the animation or kind of that I have in this slide. I hope that everybody sees my screen. By necessity, I will take perhaps a bit more EU-centric view on this title, Data Governance and Geopolitics, and I can really recommend that you read the report of Pari and Gregory that is extensive and deals with many of the issues that they have been presenting here so very well, and it's really food for thought. So, yeah, okay. So let me see if I, so let me talk a little bit about data in this geopolitical context. I call it data in the political pressure cooker. And You know, we sometimes say data is the new oil. Well, oil is also often put into pressure cookers and then refined, but here we are talking about a different kind of pressure cooker. And this is where there is an intersection between the pressures coming from geopolitics, from digital disruption and dominance, and from global challenges. And these geopolitical tensions, they have really been changing over the past few years. It's the US-China, the US-Russia, Europe, China, Europe, Russia, also tensions, China, India, other parts of the world, and even more so in the past 4 years than now, I think the transatlantic tensions that played a role in geopolitics. And people have been speculating whether the old system of states and regions and all geopolitical competition is back again, but it's really there. It is really something that does play an important role nowadays. And the digital disruption and dominance, we all know, it's not only that digital is so disruptive, and often in a very, very positive sense. I think that's also why we are here, to make sure that it is and continues to be positive, but also with a lot of disruption that has been painful, and actually also the rise of the dominant platforms, the GAFAs, also the Chinese platforms that have captured a lot of actually what is happening around data in the world. And the global challenges, I don't want to limit those global challenges to those that are digital, but also the challenges like COVID-19 that we see nowadays, or climate change that we see, or poverty and exclusion rather than inclusion. We still have a global south in the most painful way. So these global challenges that translate into things like migration, inequity in vaccinations, the disappearance of natural assets, those challenges often go also into this pressure cooker. And what do they affect? There are many things that they affect, but here we are mostly talking, of course, about data. So one thing that it does affect is privacy at the individual level, and privacy also in a broader sense, like our perception of what privacy means for society as a whole. And that ultimately goes into kind of larger notions around surveillance society. And we have seen that in the debate about the COVID apps, that there is this very, very difficult trade-off. We have to deal with the global challenge. We want to deal there with digital means, but we have a risk that we are getting into something that may be seemingly good at the individual level, but if we design it wrongly, we may end up in a surveillance society. And the surveillance society, we say that's what we don't want. That's one form of geopolitics that is perhaps not desirable for many people. But at higher levels, or not higher levels, at other levels, this is also about competitiveness. This is also about jobs of the future. This is about, do I still have a say about what is happening to my data and the value added that is created from that? For example, this analysis for new health cures. And if my data are no longer with me, but in another country, can I then create the jobs that are these data analytics jobs that are, after all, the jobs that I would like my kids also to be playing a role in? And there are others like the jobs that are coming out of logistics and industrial supply chains and what have you. And then beyond that, in the pressure cooker, we find the public interests that are at stake, public interests such as we see them expressed in data that might be used for the circular economy. We have a lot of challenges there to protect the natural environment, assets, materials, and circular economy seems to be a way out, but then we really, really need to have a grip on what is happening with data and who actually uses these data for real good. And you see that then, again, geopolitics comes up. People are talking about, for example, carbon tax. If you are not allowed to import or you pay a carbon tax, if you are not sufficiently doing your best to create a more sustainable environment. And then we get to things like national security. And you see national security has been increasingly entangled with data. I think Gregory and Pari really addressed that in a very good way. And then a word that has come up very much in the European scene, but actually worldwide, is sovereignty. So I'm not saying that sovereignty is driving all of that, but it has become a really important word, sovereignty, strategic autonomy, in the European scene, but I would say probably also in the United States. Perhaps there it's called national security, but national security is also in the United States translated in having a say about your future, for example, on key technologies like semiconductor technologies, 5G, 6G, quantum technologies. And there's a report of October of the White House about critical and emerging technologies, and a whole list of these technologies. I said they are really essential for the future of the United States. And this is what other countries will also say. China has a plan for mastering and controlling a whole set of these technologies. So this is kind of like the pressure cooker, and sovereignty is a difficult word. Not only because some people don't like the word, but then, okay, use national security if you prefer that, but as even you are talking about sovereignty, because this sovereignty is about the things, what belongs to you, what you find important as a country, your geography, the people that are living there, the natural resources, the borders, but increasingly also other national assets. And so data is becoming for many actually a sovereign asset, not so much different from the oil that is in your is on your territory. That's a sovereign asset. So for many, data is a sovereign asset. Data, and it depends which kind of data, but you can imagine that there's something to be said for that. For example, the data that are capturing even the DNA of your flora, your fauna, of your people, they are considered like a sovereign asset. But perhaps cultural data is also a sovereign asset. You know, it's after all, it belongs to us. And what about health data? And this is actually what Thierry Breton, the European Commissioner for Digital, said, health data belongs to us. And therefore, I think, that's what he said, that these data should be processed in Europe or under control of the Europeans, if it is health data. And you may disagree with that, because you could say, well, health data, you know, they are really about global challenges like COVID, so make sure that everybody around the world can use that. But okay, we've got health data and health data, perhaps that's what we have to say. Now, if you talk about sovereignty, just briefly to keep in mind, how do you protect your sovereignty? In the past, you would build a castle and the king would be in the castle, you would pull up the bridge and have a moat. Nowadays, in sovereignty, that's much, much more difficult. Of course, you deal with sovereignty still as the core task of your army, defending that. But often you deal also with sovereignty in a best effort way. It's risk management. You deal with it with strategic partners like in NATO or in the European Union, or actually in quite a number of cases, you see that you might best deal with sovereignty by dealing with that at the global level. That everybody's sovereignty is best guaranteed if you manage the internet as a global asset. Now, let me focus on one particular aspect, because Pari also asked me and Gregory asked me to do so, and that's looking a little bit at cybersecurity and just illustrating how complex actually the landscape has become. And therefore, it's not so easy to talk about data governance in a geopolitically charged environment. So the global challenge, the main challenge here you might call is cyber threats, and these are state-sponsored cyber attacks or cyber espionage and cyber disruption, and it's very much also criminals. Just today, someone told me that now the business of cybercrime is worth $5 trillion, and in 2025 it will be 10 trillion. It's the largest business in the world. It's incredible. Cyber threats are massive and very disruptive, as Gregory rightly has pointed to SolarWinds, for example, and the colonial pipeline, and so many states have been threatened through hybrid cyber war. Now, the complexity of the landscape is, and here I'm talking a bit from illustrating it from the European perspective, is that if we talk about laws that people are drawing up to deal with cyber threats, then in the European context, recently we talk about the Network and Information Security Directive, NIS Directive, and two means it's just being revised, it's in the second version. I had the pleasure to work and negotiate the first version of this directive. And that's a directive that's really much more about cyber resilience of your critical infrastructure. So that's that challenge there. how do you keep your critical infrastructures up and running? Your oil pipeline, indeed, electricity, water, your health system, etc. Now they have seen that, it's not enough to only talk about those critical infrastructures. Actually, a lot more is nowadays a critical infrastructure. Cloud, in a broad sense. The social media are critical infrastructure because you can distort them and then make your democracy run into the wall by misinformation. And also critical infrastructures are being recognized as the domain name system, which is very much close to your heart, I would assume. And so that has to be better protected. And more than that, actually, this revised Network and Information Security Directive, which was about cyber resilience, has now also said, hey, there is something going on there. We had this whole debate about 5G security, and we have drawn up recommendations to make sure that the security of 5G is actually corresponding to national and EU security requirements, that national security cannot be damaged through 5G, and you have to be careful about selecting your suppliers. And the whole debate about then saying you cannot actually, for a number of countries, select Huawei and ZTE as suppliers. Now, that 5G security approach is now also translated into other sectors that likewise have to do a security assessment, and that likewise have to start looking at their supply chain. And Gregory also mentioned that supply chain management. But hey, this is pure geopolitics also, isn't it? Because this is not only about just the hard technical security requirements, but also who's actually controlling your supplier, who's behind that, and what type of intentions may that state have. So here you see that this NIS2 directive has become much more from kind of technical cyber resilience, a thing that touches upon the sovereignty of your state or the sovereignty of your region. And there are others there that determine the name of the game in the field of cybersecurity in the EU. The Cyber Act, which is about certifying ICT equipment for security. And in the financial sector, for example, there's now a proposal called DORA, which means Digital Operational Resilience. And that's a law that has been proposed, which looks also at how the financial sector, which is a global sector, deals with their suppliers, cloud suppliers, for example, or identity providers, and imposes specific requirements that they have to deal with. And these requirements are security, but also about how you deal with data. And here, data and security, they are really back to back. Very often actually a security problem becomes a data problem. And I don't need to mention the GDPR that was already mentioned, the evidence proposal. So quite a lot of work which is very, very close to data security and ICT security. But to make it more complex, of course, these type of laws are actually part of larger strategies, of a security union strategy, of a cybersecurity strategy that has recently been revised, and of the digital strategy of Europe, which is now called the Digital Decade. And all of these strategies have also a very strong international dimension. And in these international parts, they talk about traditional partners like the United States. They talk about neighboring partners to work together with them. They talk about collaboration with Africa, for example, with Asian countries. They talk about collaboration or competition or a form of coexistence with China. So that is the determining part of the policy scene, and it's actually not over. There's even more. I've indicated in a lower, in a gray font here, some other related laws, but there are other related laws, for example, like the Digital Markets Act that you have heard about, perhaps that is addressing the dominance of certain platforms, the gatekeeper platforms, and the Digital Services Act, which is about how do you deal with illegal content and harmful content in a common way. And so these are also all bits and pieces of related legislation that you have to think about when you say, I want to deal with the challenges of data and the flow of data and the use of data. And around that are all kind of bodies that are playing. I'm not even mentioning here initiatives like the European Health Data Space, for example, which is an idea that we can make data in the field of health interoperable, high quality, reusable across the European Union. And the picture is complex, unfortunately, but that's the way, that's life. You know, there are all kind of bodies around it. So more the security side, you have the ENISA, which is a security agency that helps to build up expertise, but there's also the network, international network of computer emergency response teams, which is the first network. Then you have, of course, at the crime side, Europol, Interpol, and others that are dealing with, for example, the exchange of data that can help to resolve criminal cases. And then very recently, it has been proposed, for example, in the context of the EU-US collaboration to create the Trade and Tech Council. And the Trade and Tech Council will also deal with data and how data can flow or it cannot flow in a transatlantic way. And let's not forget, and I think here Gregory really pointed to something important, there's a tremendous role also of industry here. You know, industry organizations and international standards are determining really a lot of what we actually can and cannot do with data and how we relate data, for example, to security or to dealing with global challenges like a circular economy, where interoperability will play a huge role and international standards will play a huge role. So this is just mentioning a few of the bodies that are around when you only take a topic like cybersecurity. So unfortunately, the world is complex, but that does not take away that I think it's very good that you engage in this debate, Gregory and Pari, to talk about data and better data governance. And then United Nations in the field of cybersecurity plays a very important role if we talk about how states should behave, the norms and values of state behavior. So let's think for a minute about stepping up global collaboration on data. And I've got here more questions than answers, but perhaps that's good for the debate as also Gregory and Pari have talked about D20. So imagine you want to set up a more extensive collaboration on data. Then first of all, the question is, what is actually the underlying thinking there? What is it that is to be pursued? Is it a global common good? Do we consider data a global common good? Or perhaps the free flow of data, is that the common good? So I said already, if you talk about common goods, you can actually safeguard sovereignty. So perhaps that is the way to go. But I think we need to be very critical about the notion of, for example, the free flow of data, because not all data need to flow freely and not all data can flow freely. So obviously national security data cannot. Perhaps health data cannot flow freely because they are considered a sovereign asset. And there may be lots of other data, for example, data of public administrations that are not falling under free flow, or perhaps you have to couple free flow of data to free flow. Does that also mean free use of the data? And obviously it does not mean free use of the data. It's flow with conditions, it's reuse with conditions. You would not want that data can flow freely, your competitors walk away with it, you are going to lose your business, you are going to lose your jobs, etc. And this is precisely what is felt has happened due to the practice of the big platforms. They have kind of taken the data, but not delivered back the value added to that in many instances, and made in the meantime huge profits. And also this free flow then depends very, very much upon your worldview, the four worldviews that you have indicated: Silicon Valley, the Brussels view, the Beijing view, the Moscow view, your view of the world. So free flow of data is, I think, is a dubious notion. We have to break that down. We have to be critical about it. So what are we actually doing when we talk about global collaboration on data? What is precisely happening? Then there's only one question here. Then, of course, as has been indicated, which parties are already active? And would it be better to perhaps support them rather than create an alternative for them? Is really the current system failed? And there are many important parties there that seem to deliver. ICANN, G20, the UN to an extent, the Global Partnership on Artificial Intelligence, the OECD, this Trade and Tech Council, perhaps, that still needs to come there, the Paris Accord, And many of them are actually, not many, a number of them are actually also private-public partnerships or multi-stakeholder partnerships. So what is the role of a wider collaboration on data? Is it perhaps thought leadership to break out the established silo thinking? And finally, and I should also add here in terms of which parties are already active, I should have added here inclusiveness. Are all parties on board? In particular, I think also the Global South. And for example, G20 does not have the Global South on board as such. Necessary capabilities and capacities then, if you want to collaborate, you need to have quite a lot of resources and quite a lot of capacity and capability also to tap into decision makers' networks. And I think that's a serious question to ask. There are already so many initiatives around. I showed it in the field of cybersecurity. What is the right value added and the right way to go about to step up global collaboration on data, which I have to emphasize, and I very much here sympathize with the efforts that Pari and Gregory are taking. There should definitely be more happening in terms of global data governance, even if we are living in a geopolitically charged world. So let me stop at this point, unfortunately with a number of questions, but that's, I think, also the nature of your meetings to debate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. I think you have raised a significant number of questions, and we do have some additional questions in the chat. I could add to that list myself, but I will refrain from doing that. And for the sake of keeping the discussion structured, what I propose would be for me to start off with going through the questions that have been posted thus far in the chat. With your permission, I will read through them, allowing our speakers to take a position towards any of the questions that they feel are appropriate. And with time remaining, I would love to hear back from the floor. I see, for example, we have ICANN.org's representatives here joining us today, both following the European conversations on cybersecurity and sovereignty and the UN processes that Paul has mentioned. So I would love to hear back from the floor, but keeping our timing in mind, I will start off with going through the questions we have received thus far, with your permission, and then I will give the floor back to our panelists to try and reply to these. And then, time permitting, we will go back to the floor and hopefully take some live questions from those who have joined us here today. And I do appreciate the high participation that we have for today's panel. Going through the questions, the first came right at the beginning of your presentations from Shiva. In matters related to data governance, asks Shiva, there are countries that haven't caught up to the European level of awareness of the harm, and yet other countries that are on a different direction with complex agendas. Is there a way for the world to move towards global governance of data involving all concerned actors from various geographies in a manner that would also harmonize positions between geographic regions? That is our first question. Then we have a question from Oksana. What do you think about Ukraine's role? So I understand this is in these processes that we are discussing. Then there is a comment and a question coming from Roberto. When we say the world, we really mean the developed world, or even the wealthy part of the developed world. Can we guess a date at which a shepherd in Central Asia will have sensors in his body? That's another question from Roberto. We have a question from Glenn. I think that is a question, so I'm putting that on my list as well. I wonder if Biden will hire Krebs. Is this the Five Eyes group? I understand that this was referring to Greg's part of the presentation. We have another question from Oksana. E-privacy regulation and the recent German law based on e-privacy regulation. Could you please comment on this? I would assume this might target more Paul's intervention, but I welcome comments from all of our panelists. And then Roberto comments and asks, the problem I see is that when we talk of data, we seem to assume that we talk about something that does not have a value? Why cannot we approach the flow of immaterial goods as data in the same way as we approach flow of material goods? Does anybody assume that we should allow unrestricted free flow of material goods without any control or supervision? Why would immaterial goods trade be different? These are the questions I have noted thus far. I would be inclined to go through our panelists, hopefully starting with Pari, if you would be willing to take up the first one, since you were the first speaker, then going to Gregory, and then going to Paul to try and address these questions at your individual discretion. And then time permitting, and I will be the timekeeper, I apologize for this, and then time permitting, we will take questions from the floor. Again, I will stop here. Pari, if you would like to select some of these questions, address any of these concerns, we will then go to Gregory and then to Paul.
Sure, I must admit, I don't remember all the questions you mentioned, so I start with the last one, posing question about free flow of data. So I like to clarify that nobody suggests here that all data have to be free. So there are data that needs to be free and there are data that shouldn't be free. So there are different categories and different policies towards them. So when we talk about free flow of data, we are talking about when no data is allowed to be free. So there's a difference here. So I hope that responds to the last question. There was a lot of questions. Some of the questions posed the differences between global south and north, whether they will be able, for example, we talked about Central Asia and the corridors being made there. Now, inevitably, these corridors are infused by latest technology, and inevitably it's going to bring ability for the region to have access to many of the goods and bads of digital era. So that's kind of progress being made in terms of D20 and the model it has. It's a stakeholder model. It sees itself as a complement to the current systems, current institution, current efforts, and current dialogue that is being made. So the idea, we don't have a specific agenda in terms of what is the common good. That's the whole purpose of us having convenings, bringing thought leaders together from various in a multi-stakeholder model to come up what should be the priority and in what shape and form. So we don't impose vision on that particular common good. So these are the questions I remember. I probably missed several of them, and yeah, so I give back the floor to you to continue with the other questions.
Thank you, Pari. I would be inclined to hear back from Gregory and then Paul. Gregory, if you would like to pick out any of these questions and address them, if it would be useful for me to reiterate any of these, I'm happy to do that as well. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me just pick up a couple important, interesting points that were made. I think the question about value is really very interesting. And it's certainly true that there's no reason why immaterial things shouldn't have value just like material things. And that, I think, does need to infuse our discussion and does affect, I think, how we think about the free flow of data. In principle, we'd like it to flow pretty freely, but recognizing that it has value just like other things. If there's a difference, Paul raised the analogy with black gold oil, between oil and data. What's interesting for me is the difference, that oil is valuable no matter what the quantity is. What's striking about data is it becomes more and more valuable the more of it there is to put together, to assemble. So there is, in that sense, it seems to me, a big difference between that immaterial data and the material objects we're used to in trade. There was a question about the Five Eyes. I'm not sure exactly what the Five Eyes, as you know, is the sort of Anglo-Saxons who gather about intelligence matters. I think that was coupled with Mr. Biden. Mr. Biden, I think, is certainly, as we've seen, and Paul said, he's reached out to allies in ways that his predecessor didn't, and that's all to the good. I'm not sure exactly what role the Five Eyes have to play in this realm, because it seems to me the stakeholders are, the close stakeholders are a much bigger group that include lots of people who aren't NATO members or treaty allies or members of the Five Eyes. I would have, even when I was in government, in intelligence, I always wished we could expand the Five Eyes and make it a more inclusive group. But then you got into the question of who would you include and who would you not? That was a very tricky question. I hope we can avoid that. A final point, I think Pari talked about this as well, and that is that I think we've all said that the global South is very definitely underrepresented in the conversations that go on. So finding ways to do better that way, whether it's RD20 or some other way, but basically, in addition to the usual governments and even Southern governments, we want to make sure that civil society groups in both the North and the South are part of this conversation. And so that's why we put such emphasis in the D20 on a multi-stakeholder, getting the right people in the room.
Let me continue from
Great,
here.
thank you
Joanna.
very much. Paul, go ahead. Yes, thank you.
I would like to start with the shepherd. I was just wondering, does the shepherd have a mobile phone? If he's got a mobile phone, then he is very near to having a sensor in the body, because with the mobile phone, the movements can be tracked. Perhaps if he's got a mobile phone and a smart watch, then the blood pressure can be checked, sleeping patterns, etc., etc. So perhaps the answer is, yeah, the shepherd actually has today, is connected through a sensor with the large internet. What is an important question is, of course, others that have to do with what about the sheep? Are they also getting sensors, and are they also tracked? And I would think that that perhaps this will go faster than we think. You see now such developments happening in various places in the world, and I must really also say that there are some great examples coming from China, even if that's not the country that I find the most favorable nation, but in terms of making sure that there's a much higher type of connectivity, as also previously speakers have said, that we are going to move into in a much more greater volume of data, precisely because of this connectivity, sensors, and what have you. I want to also connect to what Pari earlier said about the global collaboration and where you could go there. And that question about it, is there something that we can do, even if there are such different views in the world about who's like-minded or not? And Joanna knows that in the past I've said, for example, well, perhaps you shouldn't start head-on with the data issue per se, if you want to have more global collaboration, but actually with what kind of use that the data have to tackle a global challenge. And I'm thinking of health. So indeed, if we talk about the use of health data and collaborating on health data and using that to find treatments, for example, against contagious diseases that are creating havoc in the world, then, well, many of us would agree that this is really an important area to collaborate. And gosh, I mean, it's really a scandal if then cyber criminals are attacking the hospitals, isn't it? So we should also go after those cyber criminals jointly that have that are so reckless and so irresponsible to attack hospitals. Well, if we start working together on an area like health and data, also in the interest of security, perhaps we are actually talking about something that where we can find common ground, where indeed we are talking about global common good, and where we can even reuse organizations like WHO, but also many others, to help us work together. Organizations that have a lot of experience also in these other aspects that come with data, not the technical aspects, but the aspects, for example, of skills and awareness and understanding, and knowing what you can do and what you cannot do with data and AI. So I've always said that, shouldn't we try and get some kind of coalition going that actually works seriously on global governance in health and data, and then get that moving forward? And a lot will flow from that. Trust will flow from that, but obviously we will also get then from there into more sensitive areas. A ransomware attack on a hospital might be the same ransomware attack that actually disables a colonial pipeline. And obviously there we are getting into other territory of collaboration. So I think that if we are zooming in a bit more about, as Pari also rightly said, not all data are necessarily there free to flow, but there are certain types of data that, that are better suited for global collaboration and for free flow for sure. Now, and so I think we can get global progress. Then a rather technical question was there around the e-privacy regulation and the recent law in Germany on e-privacy. I don't know that law in detail, but I do remember that in Germany, they still had something to fix in the transposition of the e-privacy directive, which is the e-privacy law that is currently in force. And I think they have done a correction in order to do that transposition, meaning they bring the European law into national law. They have done that recently. So as I understand it, the main thing there is that they are now in line with the existing e-privacy law, but that's a bit the question how long that will last, because the e-privacy law is actually subject to revision, and there is a negotiation going on already quite a long time, I must say, to replace the e-privacy directive with an updated e-privacy law in Europe. Yeah, and here very speculatively, but perhaps Gregory actually knows more about that because he has been at the heart of the administration. Biden and Cripps, how I read that type of question is, can we get some continuity of things, you know, continuity of expertise, which is so important. You know, this constant change of views and opinions really doesn't help very much. And the power of those that are trying to conquer the world, perhaps in less good ways with data, is that they have continuity. Governments should have more continuity in their policy making. Handing back to you, Joanna.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm utterly enjoying this discussion. I think we should have reserved at least 3 hours for you guys to be able to share your expertise. And this is what comes with hiring for such a panel, experts like yourselves. It is with a breaking heart that I need to ask you guys to summarize. We have received more questions. What I would propose is for you to try and summarize this discussion, as challenging as it might be. And again, thank you for the differing perspectives within the next 3 minutes. We have received some questions and they are quite succinct. So I will just put them on your tables, on your agenda, asking you to briefly summarize, possibly within the context of these questions. And then I'm going to hand back to my friend and colleague, Mate Mester, who will try to summarize our entire discussion. Good luck with that, Mate. So the questions we've received during the responses focus on 4 issues. The first question comes from Andrei Kolesnikov, who is our ALAC liaison, very focused and very expert on the technical side of cybersecurity and internet governance. I personally like the Gaia X initiative, says Andrei. Can you put more light on industrial data for I4O, Internet 4.0, I understand. Then there is a question for from Avery Doria, an ICANN board member. I understand with a request for clarification from Greg with reference to Anglo-Saxons and a kind request for a clarification who these might be. Then there is a very specific question from Dr. Gopal, based at Anna University in India. Is there any case study where governance and management are seamlessly integrated, and is it pragmatic enough? And then the last question from Adam Peak, who is interested to know if there are any comments on Apple's iOS Ask App Not to Track option, which seems to be having an impact with a significant number of us selecting the Do Not Track option. And is this a follow-on from the GDPR and the California Acts, that the opportunities that they offer or is it just another app that Apple has offered to us? So how tangible is that solution? I understand from Adam's question. I would give the floor back to our speakers again in the same order, if you would allow. Pari, and then Greg, and then Paul. 3 minutes, if you can do it, but we will have you back. We loved this, so we will definitely have you back. And again, thank you, Pari, for setting this up. And then I'm going to head back to Mate for a brief summary. Thank you, everyone. Pari.
Thank you. So I take on the last question which Adam Pick posed in terms of Apple. While I think it's important that the private sector starts to self-regulate, but I am not particularly optimistic on what's happening. The private sector is not an elected body and driven by different interests than general public. So while what Apple is doing is beneficial, but I think it's too little, too late. And I think that I do like to see more regulations when it comes to privacy there. So yeah, it's helping, I'm using it, but nevertheless, I don't think it resolves our problem. On other questions, I'm trying to remember the question. Could you repeat the first question kindly?
Of course, Pari, the first comes from Andre, who's asking about the Gaia X initiative, and if you can put more light on industrial data for I4O.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with that, so I let somebody else to answer that question. Thank you.
Thank you. Gregory? You're muted, sir.
Sorry.
Unmute. Thank you.
Sorry if I was cryptic about the Anglo-Saxons. The Five Eyes is an intelligence group that comprises the United States, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and Britain. I suppose that we thus make Quebecers honorary Anglo-Saxons. In any case, it's been a useful intelligence group. Whether it's, as I said earlier, whether it's much of a model for anything beyond that is not so clear to me, because a group of people, even countries, needs to be more inclusive than that. We talked a bit about continuity, and will Biden rehire Krebs? What's interesting is that almost all of Biden's major appointments in this realm have been former NSA people. So they're certainly people that know the business. They're real professionals. That, I think, will provide a kind of continuity. I agree with Pari on Apple. I think it's a significant move. I think it is a response to GDPR and CCPA. Needs to go further. We're going to continue. Our, I think, bias in the forum is that these conversations need to be global and cooperative, not necessarily national and punitive, though there's going to be some regulation. But we know that the 20th century tools that we have to deal with these issues, like antitrust, are not very effective and are surely very slow. The other thing that struck me about our conversation is how ubiquitous geopolitics is. When you think about data, it does permeate almost every facet of the way we think about data, from even mundane things like where data centers are located, turns out to be a geopolitical issue. And I think Paul raised 5G and Huawei, which is a perfect illustration of the extent to which these decisions that might be thought of as mostly commercial ones have very big geopolitical significance. Thanks to ICANN for making this conversation happen.
Let me take up Joanna then from here. While I would love to have a further discussion with Roberto Gaetano about shepherds and sheep, I will not do that here, but just pick up on 2 points that were made. Gopal asked a question about data governance and actually implementation. So you can think nicely about it, but and design some kind of organization, but it also really has to happen. And asking for a case study, perhaps a macro level case study, I would say look at 2 things. One that has happened, look at the electronic identity system and the e-government system in Estonia, because that's a case where I think you see a combination of governance and data management coming together, enabled by technology. And I would say follow what is happening around what is called the Green Digital Passport or the COVID Pass. If you want to have an example from the European Union, because that should also be a forthcoming example where you can really critically look at data management, what is on the COVID Pass and what is actually the complete governance around it. And then the other question very briefly on Gaia X and industrial data for the question for industrial data for Industry 4.0 from Andre. Gaia X is an initiative that you also have to see as something that fits in this geopolitical thinking. It has a lot to do with data, so it's an interesting initiative. What is it that the Europeans are trying to do? Are they trying to take over the cloud from Google and Amazon? No, they are saying, we do want to have more control on the economic value of the cloud and also on the trust aspect, the personal data aspect that has to do with the cloud. But what we are aiming for is the cloud that is to come. That is the value added in the cloud, which is AI and trust. That's where you can capture value. You can also determine the rules there, and you can create value added services. And the second is that there is, someone somewhere said, we still have 10 years to go in the development of the cloud. And in the next 10 years, we are going to have, for example, edge cloud, which will be very, very important for industrial data. And that goes together with Industry 4.0. So the Europeans are trying to gain back ground, but also actually not to gain back ground from the past, not to take back control, but to win in the future.
Thank you very much, Paul. This was a really, really exciting discussion. All I'm left to do is thank Pari for setting it up and hand it straight into Mate's hands to summarize in 5 minutes. Good luck, fingers crossed. Thank you very much for allowing me to moderate.
Thank you.
Hello. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Can you hear me well?
We can hear you well, Mate. Go right ahead.
Okay, thanks a lot. And in the same time, there is a alarm going off in the background, so I will be very, very, very quick, and I will leave the building after that. So we had a very, very nice discussion today on governance and geopolitics, and our excellent speakers with a diverse background covered a huge range of important topics. And in the beginning, Ms. Pari Esfandiari, in her introductory presentation, emphasized that data has become indeed a key strategic asset, and it used to be, it used to be a byproduct of internet. And by today, the data governance is a complex issue with many layers and dynamics. And she also emphasized that politics and cultural differences also affect how data is treated. And she mentioned the American and the US and the American, the European and the Chinese model, and the great Chinese model, and so on and so forth. Later on, Ms. Gregory Treverton also emphasized the three main models of the internet, the American, the European, and the Chinese. He elaborated a bit further on the important factors in the US and China and Russia, EU and India affecting data governance. He also mentioned that the rise of the tech giants combined with geopolitical forces also have an impact on how data is treated. And they have mentioned, and Ms. Pari Esfandiari mentioned the digital corridors, which has been created. She came up with a couple of examples, like the one, like the digital Silk Road in China, as well as the India, Iran, Russia's agreement, which create a vertical corridor on the global map. And of course, she also mentioned that there are many dimensions of data, such as privacy, trade, antitrust, security, diplomacy, content, and many more. And later on, they elaborated more on privacy, on content, on security, as well as on trade as important factors. And on privacy, for instance, Mr. Gregory Treverton mentioned that there is a difference between the Gdpr and the CCPA in their approach in opt-in and opt-out, which has a huge influence on business. But the biggest challenge is how to cope with volume, perhaps in the future, because in the future, an increasing amount of data will be collected. And then Pari on content elaborated on the different models in India and the EU, which is a rather proactive regulation. whereas, for instance, in the US, content is mostly governed by freedom of expression, while China, we rather see censorship and propaganda. On security, Mr. Gregory Treverton mentioned that cyber legacy is, well, yeah, I'm sorry, I'm a bit confused here. Anyway, he mentioned here a couple of examples like cyber attacks, the SolarWinds and the Colonial Pipeline, and he also mentioned the rules of the road, which is very, very important. And he mentioned, for instance, in part of this, the China and the US agreement on not to espionage on commercial interests, which seems to work very well so far. And basically on trade, I think the conclusion was that there is a lack of concept of what is digital trade, which has a negative impact. And therefore, there is a need for global collaboration. And their problem statement basically was that there is a patchwork of laws of industry and self-regulation. And therefore, perhaps the solution for this patchwork and would be what they call the D20, which is a multi-stakeholder model adapted to the new geopolitical context, which involves Internet Foundation organizations, Bretton Woods institutions, think tanks, with the goal basically to broaden the dialogue, shift the focus, and create actionable and measurable outcomes, and which would be basically a complementary institution to the current institutions that we know today. In his speech, Mr. Paul Timmers continued the discussion, and he basically said that data is indeed governed by complex rules and are under a pressure cooker, basically. And in this pressure cooker, there is geopolitics, digital disruption and dominance, like the rise of tech giants. And there are global challenges as well, which are very important, such as the COVID-19 pandemic and climate change and poverty. And these affect many factors like privacy, competitiveness, public interest, national security, and sovereignty, which perhaps is the most important thing. However, it is very difficult to protect sovereignty today because it's not like in the old ages that it's like a castle that you can erect, that you can protect with walls. But
de mieux en mieux. L'application est momentanément indisponible.
And I'm sorry, someone's mic is not muted, and it's very, very annoying. So anyway, when explaining what sovereignty is today, he explained the concept and the complexity of the regulations behind sovereignty with the cybersecurity rules in the EU. Where, for instance, it is highly regulated what is considered critical infrastructure, and there are many other specific regulations, like the upcoming Digital Operational Resilience Act in the financial sector. And these bits and pieces basically have a huge impact on how we use data, and therefore these very complex of rules and institutions driving data governance frameworks. And in stepping up global collaboration on data, for which the D20 could be a great example, he mentioned that there are rather questions than answers. For instance, it is very hard to define what is a common good at a global level. For instance, not all data can flow freely. And another question would be whether organizations at the global level should rather be supported than replaced. And I think the most important message here was that Mr. Paul Timmers mentioned as well, is that inclusiveness is a very important factor, and all parties should be on board in global discussions. And basically, the main question today, what we try to discuss is how to move forward, or what is the right way to move forward. And I will try to summarize just in 1 minute the questions and what answers were given to the questions. But basically, during the Q&A session, Pari basically clarified that not all data should be free. Of course, not every data can flow freely. And she also emphasized that multi-stakeholder D20 should be a complement to the current framework and dialogue and not a replacement. Whereas in the same time, Gregory Treverton, I think this was the point where we learned. I think it's very interesting that we learned that value is very different to define value. For instance, immaterial value is very different from material, because he mentioned that, for instance, more and more data is more valuable, which is completely different from oil. I think that is a very interesting point. And he also mentioned that Global South is indeed underrepresented in global discussions, and that's why in the D20 model, they suggested to have a rather multi-stakeholder model, and at least the societies and private parties from the Global South can be involved in the discussions. And later on in the answers, we learned that health data, for instance, mentioned by Mr. Paul Timmers, is on the one hand very important to tackle global pandemic, while at the same time it should be protected from cyber attacks, of course. So therefore it is very, very difficult to agree how to handle health data at a global level, while there is still a need for global cooperation and building trust in such data too. And well, this will be needed very much in the future. And well, yeah.
Mate, we're just
I
worried
think I would
about
conclude
you. There are
here.
people literally concerned about your safety. Are you safe? Good. Okay, great.
Yes, I'm
we
safe.
just wanted to make sure
I'm
that
safe.
Okay.
Yes,
good,
no
with
problem.
the fire alarm.
So and
thank you.
And I think I will wrap it up here. Thanks a lot. And I think we had a very, very interesting and very detailed discussion. It was very, very difficult to summarize it as well. And I think now is the time to give the floor to Sebastian to cover the next steps. Thank you very much.